Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Tuesday, March the 18th, 2025. My name's Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. Welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne's, the podcast that gives you everything you need for the day ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes. And it's a busy one.
After 12 days of leaks, finally, it's Liz Kendall's big day. She announces the government's welfare crackdown. The big news story on the agenda is Kemi Badenoch's speech, her announcement that the UK's principal green commitment that we will reach net zero emissions by 2050 is a fantasy and unachievable. And it's also a big day in schools reform. The government want you to hear that they are retaining SATs in primary schools. What will happen to older children, we'll find out later today.
Well, they're the main topics today, but there's a lot elsewhere too. And overnight, Israel has launched extensive strikes on Gaza, just a day after Foreign Secretary David Lammy escalated the UK side criticism of Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, saying for the first time directly that it is breaking international law by stopping aid into Gaza and that the Israeli Prime Minister is, quote, starving children. President Trump is due to hold talks by phone with President Putin over Ukraine to discuss the dividing up of Ukraine.
But it's Tuesday. And as you know, every Tuesday, we've got the YouGov Sky Times poll. And the broad picture of an era of three-party politics at the top is unchanged. There's no real movement outside the margin of error. Labour is up 2 on the week on 26. Reform up 1 on 24. Conservatives unchanged on 22. Lib Dems on 14. Greens on 9. And two final things for the roundup. A crowd pleaser from the government, they hope. But it's got precious little coverage as far as I can see in the papers. The government is getting rid of its corporate credit cards for civil servants. And Johnny Reynolds, the business secretary, arrives in the US for talks on trade. Can he get some kind of quickie deal to stave off even more tariffs in a couple of weeks? Spoiler alert, probably not. But Anne, you saw your old mucker, Mark Carney, one-time bank governor, and McElvoy familiar, now Prime Minister of Canada, last night after seeing the King. What a lineup. Did he have any advice for an old friend on how to survive trade wars?
Well, there is actually a very clear link between these two things, Sam. So yes, I did catch up with Mark Carney at his press conference in London. I have to say, Canadian presses are a very polite scrum compared to the British polite. People actually say please and thank you, blimey, you know. But obviously Mark Carney there looking to a very swift election ahead as the new Prime Minister in Canada and public enemy number one for Donald Trump, who keeps vowing to make Canada America's 51st state. Got a great welcome in the UK. But it was interesting that no joint press conference with Keir Starmer, and the supposition there, I think, on both sides is that would not have been a good look while Jonathan Reynolds is over trying to look for that big, beautiful carve-out on steel tariffs, and some tech side talks also starting, perhaps with a view to the UK getting a deal there. Just one fun detail, Sam. There was a snappy bust-up with the Ottawa press call because Mark Carney, as you point out, former governor of the Bank of England, but very successful before that at Goldman Sachs, so shall we say not poor, is being asked about his financial interest in his blind trust, and he accused a journalist of starting from a prior of ill will, which you would never get on this podcast, would you?
No. For all your fondness, Anne, my memory of Mark Carney as Governor of the Bank of England was somebody who was quite snippy in the face of the media. Clearly, you found a way of charming him that eluded me. Let's see how well that all goes down, not just with the Canadian press corps, with Canadian voters in a couple of weeks. Right, let's do a handbrake turn. There is a very big and important announcement by Kemi Badenoch at 10:30 this morning in central London. She's kicking off her policy review this morning, which is going to dominate the Conservatives for the next 3 or so years. She's putting it in the tradition of Margaret Thatcher and of David Cameron, who both held quite extensive policy reviews. And the central point that she's going to argue this morning is that hitting net zero by 2050, in other words, having net no emissions by 2050 compared to 1990 levels, is, to use her word, impossible. She says, I don't say that with pleasure or because I have some ideological desire to dismantle it. In fact, we must do what we can to improve our natural world. I say it because anyone who has done any serious analysis knows it can't be achieved without a serious drop in our living standards or by bankrupting us. So there you have it. The consensus that has existed since it was introduced into British policy by Theresa May has been ended. It is a very big moment in our politics, I would argue. She is at pains to say that she believes in climate change. She doesn't think it's she does think it's man-made. She's at pains to say we need to take measures to help our natural environment, but she says that this legal target is a fantasy. It strikes me as a very big deal, Anne.
It is a big deal, isn't it, for the reasons that you lay out. It leaves Kemi Badenoch in a sort of odd position, really, in some ways, on climate change. It's sort of St. Augustine, isn't it? Grant me chastity, but not yet. As in, yes, I do believe that this is damaging, that man-made climate change exists. So she's not going down that route of the really hardline antis, where she's saying we can't get this done by 2050. I'm struck by the fact that she's doing this speech at a consultancy which advises a lot of big finance and business. So she's linking her pro-business credentials to pushing back on net zero. That's, in a sense, that is quite canny in terms of putting the heat, so to speak, under the government's position. But it also, I think, is one of those areas where you can unite some good opinion on the right of centre media, where there's been a bit of a split about Kemi Badenoch, probably ongoing. Is she any good or not, frankly? One thing I think where you would see that papers will lean a bit more towards the more reform kind of agenda, like the Telegraph, are very hostile to net zero. So is the Daily Mail. And the Daily Mail is actually the holdout loyalist paper, I would say, to more towards the Conservatives, a bit more sceptical about reform. Here's an issue where you can get, and I would say that also goes, possibly for others on the centre right as well. But that's quite important to her. She's got to have some media support.
I think the impact on our politics and what's going to happen is even more profound than just potentially on her poll ratings, which are not great. So the breaking of the consensus actually does, simply by the act of the Conservatives doing this as the main opposition party, imperil Britain's chances of hitting net zero, something that Kemi Badenoch thought wasn't possible. Now, Kemi Badenoch has been able to do this because clearly she sniffs that's where public opinion is heading, partly because of the papers that you just cited. But I would say that you can kind of see that there has been a gap in people making the argument in favour of net zero and climate politics in our politics now for some years. It is just the case that whilst Keir Starmer did go to COP, you have seen him pull back on making a full-throated, enthusiastic case for the need to do climate change on its own terms. It's now often dressed up as an argument around growth. Rishi Sunak, his predecessor, also really wouldn't make the case for net zero, even though under him the Conservatives supported it. So the public haven't heard these arguments very much. But by the Conservatives pulling away, one of the curious things we're going to do is probably have quite a lot of battles over whether or not net zero should remain the target for the UK, because the Tories are going to challenge Labour on it, and Labour are going to have to come up with arguments, eloquent arguments, on the case for the defence, which they haven't been making to this point. And so suddenly we're going to hear a lot more about net zero because it isn't an issue of cross-party consensus. So Downing Street strategists ought to be sharpening their lines in defence of it, or throw it under a bus.
That's so interesting. And just when you were talking there, I had a flashback. You know what it reminds me of? It's the moment when Boris Johnson, who'd ridden two horses on this and gone one way and another, decided that there was a Brexit-shaped hole in the British debate, and went unambiguously out there as the candidate of Brexit. That was a moment, a bit like you putting your finger on there, Sam, which I hadn't actually thought about, but it reminds me that where there is a hole, someone is going to fill it. And the question for Kemi Badenoch was, when did she do so? And you're absolutely right. What it then forces the other side to do is, in the way that, Remain was the kind of defaulty sort of position, now net zero is going to come under that similar pressure where you actually have to make your arguments for it. A little difficult, I would have thought, for or Keir Starmer's relations there with Ed Miliband, who's a true believer that this absolutely needs to happen as a core necessity of a Labour government to keep pursuing net zero. And as you point out, Keir Starmer's a bit, yes, we'd like to, but there are lots of other reasons why, as opposed to defending the principle. What an interesting moment.
One of the big things I've come to learn in politics over the last 20 years, and I spotted this back with tax credits under Gordon Brown, I spotted this with the UK's EU membership for many years, is ultimately people don't win arguments that they haven't been making. You do not succeed in convincing the public by shutting up and withdrawing from the space. And I think that's true day to day. Sometimes it's necessary tactically, but it is important to keep buying in the public and making the case for some of the biggest arguments in our country, because otherwise, very quietly, they crater away and rot away and opponents seep in. If you take something for granted, don't expect it to be there at the end of the process. Now, the way that net zero has always worked, and actually the way that environmental politics has always worked, has been, there has always been a little bit of a democratic deficit, sort of almost deliberately. Environmental politics has often involved putting stuff down in law and then getting the courts to enforce it. And that is actually how Britain has made really, really considerable good progress towards actually quite admirable climate targets. But it's often not involved politicians at dispatch boxes making the case. And that's all well and good. And we've got a long way down the path by doing that. And well done, everybody. But the danger is that it can lead to this moment where suddenly one side pulls away and everybody's left floundering. Because I was having a conversation with an environmentalist last week, and we were just wondering, is it completely beyond the bounds of possibility that suddenly Keir Starmer snaps and has his own green crap moment? And I'm referring there to the moment a few years into David Cameron's premiership, where having been all green and hugged trees and handed out birch trees at press conferences, which I think I've still got growing in the garden, suddenly he decided in the name of cost of living politics to junk all of that and to make much more of the other side of the argument. It strikes me that the sort of Morgan McSween direction of the Labour Party could take us tiptoeing a little bit closer towards that. In so many other areas, Number 10 looks really very happy to sort of be a little bit reformy. Could that also be the case here?
And if so, where does it leave that big pledge? I was out at COP in Baku and Ed Miliband was bouncing around talking about the UK being a leader in combating man-made climate change. There was a whole push there to sound as if we were taking the lead, but there's now a bit of do you really want to take the lead on something where your opponents are saying this is detrimental? I come back to the fact that they put it in this business and finance context. Anyway, that's probably enough. As we get slowly or never towards net zero, we should probably move on.
That's right. Now we're going to move on to welfare. This is another area where, I don't think that Number 10 is at all unhappy at some of the very, very tough rhetoric coming out of people in this debate, not least from the Prime Minister. So Liz Kendall will stand up some point between 1 and 4 in the House of Commons, depending exactly on how many statements there are. We don't know that yet, to announce what's called a green paper, which basically means a thinky paper about where welfare policy is going. In truth, actually, there's a serious amount of proper thinking that's gone into it and proposals that are outlined. I'll just tell you very quickly what's new since yesterday, because I think that's quite important. But before I do, let me just tell you, I think at the heart of the party, they are still worried. They are still worried about how this is going to land. And at the very centre, there's one big problem that remains, which is the changes that are going to be proposed today still require primary legislation. I did hear some people say the opposite yesterday. It's not true. There are changes to personal independent payments that requires legislation and therefore a vote and therefore a way of measuring the size of a rebellion. And so there is nerves about how it's all going to go. Right, just to trot through some of the changes. So in a sense, a lot of the worst stuff is already out there. We talked about that yesterday. There's going to be changes to the way, restrictions to the way people get personal independence payments. They are going to abolish, as I was saying yesterday, the work capability assessment process, and it's going to be replaced by a more human PIP-style assessment, I think. But in general, I think the shape is most people who get benefits, disability benefits, are going to get more assessments. The Tories sort of turned them off in the pandemic and didn't return them on, and they think that that's quite important to get more people into work to save money. But at the same time, those who have the worst disabilities are going to have fewer or no more reassessments. So there's sort of a different approach depending on who you are. They're going to raise the bar really quite significantly for people with mental health. Now we had Wes Streeting foreshadowing this on Sunday, but people who, for instance, think they can't leave their house, I'm not sure they're going to continue to be able to claim. But if you've got full-on agoraphobia and you'll struggle to do a job, and you get in the point system that they're going to have over 4 points at one in each of the categories, then you will continue to be able to claim. But I think that the general sense is raising the bar for mental health, and I expect Liz Kendall to make an awful lot of the £1 billion of mitigations, rises to universal credit and stuff that she's managed to sort of tussle back from Rachel Reeves through this process. So a few more details there, but really now it's all about how it lands.
And on that topic, interesting detail about the number 10 briefings that were going on yesterday to soften up backbench MPs, Sam. And my Playbook colleague Bethany Dawson has some quite fun detail on that this morning. There's one MP saying it was death by PowerPoint with little detail on policy or answering of the questions. And that's okay. That's one MP, but I know that we've all spoken to more. But there seems to be pointing both ways, doesn't it? That Keir Starmer does not want this to kind of fall in any way by the wayside. There's still that sense that MPs are being kind of bludgeoned by, as he would see it, the reality, and Liz Kendall, the reality of making big changes, and at the same time just want to take the edge off that PIP revolt. And can they do both of these things at once?
Well, that's the question, and the Tories will tie this up to the question of or link it back to the budget, where Rachel Reeves increased national insurance for employers, and the consequence of that is it's a bit more expensive to hire people. And if you're hiring people who perhaps haven't been working for quite a long time, then that is actually more expensive, and they're going to question whether or not policy is pulling in two different directions at the same time. Actually, a lot of this is about cuts, and a lot of this is about savings for Rachel Reeves. I think there's just a lot of irritation all around government about the way this whole thing has played out. The leaks initially to ITV 12 days ago, although there have been leaks to the Times and elsewhere all the way through the year, and just how the drip has inflamed Labour Party opinion, and now they're going to have to sort of manage this rebellion. Probably not a fatal rebellion, but it is something that has left quite a lot of their own side quite sour. There is a question, and to go back to the question of the wider politics of this, there aren't many things at the moment for Labour MPs and committed Labour figures to make them proud of being part of a sort of a left-wing movement at the moment. Quite a lot of the stuff reaches over the political divide and is quite painful to suck up. They just have to trust that number 10's strategic direction is the right one, and that there are dividends to be had by this kind of hunt for centre-ground voters.
It's an interesting reflection, isn't it? Maybe a lot of the problem is that sense that this has just happened helter-skelter without Labour or Labour-friendly organisations being listened to. I think that may be as much of a psychological trigger here as the big political divides on who should and shouldn't get welfare and why and how. There's an intriguing idea by Praful Nagund and the Good Growth Foundation, which is close to Labour. Your starter for 10, who remembers who Praful Nagund is? He ran against Jeremy Corbyn.
He was the candidate against Jeremy Corbyn, yes.
I mean, if you didn't know, I would actually be disappointed. I did actually obviously mean the audience, Sam. Hey, political journalist. But no, I mean, but he has this Good Growth Foundation, and one of the things that he's suggesting, I think, seems to be there to kind of give an independent advice stream to Rachel Reeves. And one of the things he's suggesting, or a report is suggesting from them this week, is that if you're an employer and you took people who've been on long-term disability and sickness, that you would kind of get something back from that, dreadful imposition of extra NI and business tax as employers see it, that you'd sort of get something back in return, which is a not bad idea. I just cannot see Rachel Reeves at the moment saying, do you know what I'll do? I'll sort of fiddling around with a change that was very unpopular that I made earlier, because I think that might be seen as eating too much away at her authority. But they're definitely looking for something that's a bit of a carrot as well as a stick.
I don't see Rachel Reeves going back on her promises, even if other cabinet ministers are made to go back on theirs. Our biggest promise to our listeners, you know this, I know this, is that we're going to wrap up in 20 minutes. We only fail a little bit every morning, but we have had the alarm. And so that's it for Politics at Sam and we will see you tomorrow, Wednesday, for another edition. See you then.
See you then. Bye.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100 every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.